So hello again, everyone, and you're very welcome to this roundtable meeting of NasCSO, a project that we're running in European Movement Ireland in coalition with the European Parliament. And this first one that we are running is focused on equality and diversity, with a particular focus, because as we discussed earlier, we could talk about this until the end of time. We could have 10 meetings on this, but this particular meeting will focus on women's issues and LGBT issues in particular when we talk about equality and diversity. So EM Ireland, for any of you who haven't heard of us, we were founded in 1954 and we are the longest established NGO working on European affairs in Ireland. And the goal of our organisation is to develop the connection between Ireland and Europe and to achieve greater public understanding of and engagement with the EU and indeed our colleagues and friends across Europe in different organisations that we would work with. So we do this by providing objective information, stimulating debate, producing relevant and timely information about Europe and Ireland's place in Europe, and by promoting public engagement. So this is through a variety of different engagements, such as these online events that we've been having for the last year and a few months, in-person events when we can again, social media, communications via media in Ireland and more broadly across Europe too. And we are part of the European Movement International Network, which is made up of 34 countries, 39 national councils. And indeed, we keep in touch with these national councils in all of the work that we do when there are developments in relevant countries across Europe. And they are based, as I say, right across Europe and more broadly countries such as ourselves, when European Movement Ireland was established in 1954 as bodies to work towards countries joining the EU, so that they're right across the world, and delighted to work with our colleagues in all parts on European Movement International's work and agenda. And indeed, our CEO, Noel O'Connell, is also the Vice President of European Movement International. So that is quite a recent development and gives us a kind of place at that international table too. NasCSO, the event you've joined today, is a roundtable meeting as part of the NasCSO project. And for anyone who hasn't figured it out, NASC is the Irish word for connection. So this is all about connecting you, civil society representatives and your organisations directly to the MEPs and to colleagues in the European Parliament. And I'll introduce them later, but we're delighted to be joined by colleagues from the European Parliament Liaison Office here in Ireland today as well. So it's not just the MEPs, there are many of us working on European affairs in Ireland and indeed for the European Parliament in Ireland. So very briefly, the European Parliament, some concepts, some roles there: acting as a voice for European citizens, representing citizens at EU level, and we're talking about parliamentary democracy, engagement and influencing debate at EU level. So for NasCSO, we're holding a series of roundtable meetings, as we call them, of CSOs from a variety of sectors. Today, all of you focused on equality, diversity, and also in different regions in Ireland. So there'll be other ones coming up in the MEP's constituency regions, such as Midlands, North West, Dublin, and you are most welcome to join those too. And we'll hopefully have your MEP representatives there for those as well. And it's a chance for us all to have a chat, to have a discussion about how your elected MEPs can support you in your civil society organisations here in Ireland. And we hope, as I say, to bring you all back together in person for some of the meetings later in the year, with restrictions allowing. Daniel Gailge acu tá an chlár ar fáil omlán trí Gailge, is féidir le teagháilíon a bhliain trí Gailge, bei imachtaí ar siúl trí Gailge agus bhreálíonn clistal leh trí Gailge, agus tá cúpla nasc an seo agus cuireann an sleán seo amach agah máth sibh ólas trí Gailge. So any of you with a bit of Gailge, if you'd like to do some of your NasCSO work through trí Gailge, we offer the programme in both languages as well. We recently launched the programme online, so if anyone isn't really sure exactly what this is all about and what the Parliament can do for you, you can watch back our official launch, which is on our website there at the link which I will send on to you and you should have received by email. And at this launch, you'll see there a little Twitter post that it was myself hosting with our CEO, Noel O'Connell, who I mentioned earlier, James Temple-Smithson from the European Parliament Liaison Office, and indeed Thomas from the European Parliament Liaison Office in Ireland too, who's joining us today. we would really encourage you to join this network of NasCSO. So it's not just about these meetings, these events, it's also about bringing you all together in a network. So we'd love for you to connect with other CSO representatives here today. I'm sure some of you in the small world that it is know each other already, but for anyone perhaps you haven't met, this is a time where we can't network, we can't connect as much as we used to, or as comfortably as we would have before with a cup of tea. Now is a chance through NasCSO to build those connections. So I'll be talking about that later, but if anyone would like to connect with anyone else on the call, we can facilitate that and link you up. So if you haven't already, or if your organization hasn't already, on the web page, you can sign in there. There's a brief snapshot of the sign up form and tell us where you're from and a bit about your interests or what you'd like to get from the program. This is about connecting you as civil society representatives with each other and connecting with ourselves on the NasCSO team so that we can offer supports to you, give you news, meetings. We've already been in touch with some of you about free workshops offered by the European Parliament on communications and so on and so forth. And also, of course, to connect you with your MEPs, which is why we're here today. So MEPs joining us today, I'll just give a really brief overview, and you can see there the bios on the sort of committees that they're on. And firstly, we'll be hearing shortly from Barry Andrews from Renew Europe, the political group in the Parliament, who is on the Committee on International Trade and the Substitute Committee on Development. And of course, Barry is an MEP for the Dublin constituency and a member of Fianna Fáil, which is part of the Renew group, of course. And of course, Barry was previously a secondary school teacher and was the TD from 2002, representing the Dún Laoghaire constituency. He was Minister of State for Children and CEO of the International Development NGO GOAL, which I'm sure you're all aware of the great work that GOAL do. And he was also Director General of the IEA, an organisation not so different to ourselves that we would work closely with as well. And he was elected to the European Parliament in 2019, and I remember at that time because we ran a campaign to encourage people to vote in the This Time I'm Voting campaign, and would have met Barry and all of our other MEP candidates at that time. Frances Fitzgerald is also with us today, I'm delighted to say, and she's with the European People's Party and the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. This is just a brief overview of what your MEPs are involved in and the sort of relevant committees, but indeed we could talk for hours and hours about what they do, but I'll leave that to them. Frances Fitzgerald is a Fine Gael MEP for Dublin City and County and a Vice President of the EPP group. She was a Fine Gael parliamentarian for over 20 years, was a senator, and so many things that I could list there. She was, of course, Taoiseach and one of the only 4 women to have ever held this position. So delighted that Frances and Barry can join us. And equally, Clare Daly is here with us from the Left Group and is on a range of committees that you can see there, including the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. And Clare was elected in 1999, having worked in students' movements like myself, and I'm sure many of you on the call, and as a trade unionist. And she served as a TD for Dublin North from 2011 to 2019 and has long campaigned on many women's issues. And just briefly, for anyone who's saying, what's an intergroup, what's a committee, just to give you a brief insight, you can read it yourselves there, but the intergroups of the Parliament can be formed by any member from a political group who wishes to form an informal exchange on particular subject areas and promote contact between the members and civil societies. And the committees then, all MEPs are divided into 20 specialised standing committees with 25 to 81 MEPs on each one. And these committees are held once or twice a month in Brussels, and I think some may be taking place today, and that's why everybody's under a bit of pressure. So appreciate again our MEPs joining us. And myself, I am Lisa Nicholas, the Head of Communications and Education at European Movement Ireland, and I'm leading on the NasCSO project. And I'm joined by my colleague Muireann O'Shea, who is our Communications and Project Assistant and my project support on NasCSO. We're also joined from the European Parliament Liaison Office in Ireland by Thomas Kramer and Patrick O'Riordan, and they'll all say a brief hello later as well. I'm delighted to be joined by all of you. This is just some of you. I think other people have logged in, and delighted to see that. But we've got a lovely range of sort of LGBT and women's groups here today. And we hope that although there are many issues, I suppose, that wouldn't transfer over both of your types of organizations, there are many where we can link up. So we're delighted to hear from you all shortly, and we'll allow you to kind of introduce yourselves and your organizations too. And just some brief bits, and as I say, we'll send on these slides to you afterwards, to highlight in the areas of equality and diversity when we're talking about gender, women's issues, LGBT issues, and the Parliament's, of course, new gender equality strategy shows a lot of areas for progress over the next few years and action by the Parliament in this area. So you can link to it there. We'll send this on to you afterwards. We've also done some recent Just the Facts publications in EM Ireland on LGBT rights, on the recovery and gender equality. We've looked at areas such as how Brexit impacts LGBTQ people, and we're looking to do more and more of this kind of work as time goes on. I've also included just a couple of links there to some of the MEPs who are joining us today, some of the recent bits that they've spoken on in these areas too. And just to say a brief congratulations, Women's Aid, someone from Women's Aid may or may not be joining us today, but just to congratulate them publicly that they have just been granted the European Citizens Prize 2021 for the To Into You campaign. And the European Citizens Prize, if you haven't heard of it, was launched in the European Parliament by the European Parliament in 2008 to recognise exceptional achievements by Europeans. And previous recipients who may be of relevance to your organisations today include Lydia Foy, who of course fought for gender recognition and did Trojan work in that area. The Irish Girl Guides, who work with Little Women, I always say, and we work closely with them through the Blue Star programme. The Blue Star programme also received it. I have to give a shout out to one of our own programmes in EM Ireland, which is a programme to work with primary school kids on educating them about Europe and the EU. And if you're interested in this yourself, if it sounds like something perhaps your organisation could be nominated for, or you're interested in finding out more about, there are some links there. And as I say, we'll share these with you afterwards. So that's it from me. I'm now going to pass over to Barry Andrews for some contributions, and then on to Claire and Francis after that. And then we'd love to hear from yourselves. So as your MEPs are speaking, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll be sure to come around to you in the discussion afterwards. More information there and how to connect with us, and do keep in touch with us. Follow us on hashtag NasCSO, or indeed share your own pictures and things from today as well. So Barry, I'll pass over to you if that's all right.
Thanks, Lisa. I hope you can see me and hear me okay. Yeah, I go back on tiles. Well, first of all, thanks for that introduction and on the work that you're doing, Lisa. And I also just specifically want to thank Francis and Claire for allowing me to go first. I'm under a small bit of time pressure, particularly given that both Francis and Claire have a lot more experience and achievements in this area than I could ever claim. So I just want to acknowledge and thank them for that. So as you've seen, my background is in national politics and in the CSO area. I was the CEO of Goal for 4 years, and to say hello to Paul there, who I know well from Plan. And it gave me a great opportunity to understand the pressures that CSOs experience. A lot of it is fundraising, a lot of it is compliance. And then there's the opportunities of advocacy, which I suppose we in the European Parliament can help with to a certain extent. It's just the one thing I really want to get across in this meeting is that I've recently taken up the role as chair of the Sdg Alliance, the Sustainable Development Goal Alliance, which is a cross-party group of MEPs that are interested in promoting the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Honestly speaking, I think they asked a few people before they got to me. I think they also, there weren't a huge number of people looking to do this job, but to me, it's a very important one. And the ambition of the Sdg Alliance, which is part of a global network of parliamentarians for global goals, the ambition is to turn it into an intergroup. You can only have an intergroup at the start of a mandate, but the SDG issue fell off the radar straight after the most recent European election. So we're getting it going again. We've had our first meeting last month where Professor Jeffrey Sachs spoke to MEPs, and he outlined some of the things that we can do, the way that we can add value as MEPs. But why I want to stress it here is that obviously one of the SDGs is gender equality. And it's therefore at the center of what we're trying to implement and what we're trying to do. But unfortunately, the SDGs have slid down the international agenda very substantially since COVID. And also the Green Deal has sort of cannibalized a lot of the public policy space that the SDGs might have hoped to occupy. So there is quite a lot of work to do in this area, but it gives me an opportunity then to engage with CSOs, to hear what your issues are, what your experience is, both nationally and internationally. So I hope that after this meeting, we can continue to work together on those issues. Another issue I'm working on is Syria, and I've been doing some work, particularly on the humanitarian side, and we've had some very positive news led by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and our representation at the UN in the Security Council. The cross-border humanitarian access has been renewed for the 12 months, and that's really important. There are 4 million people residing in northwest Syria who rely on that pipeline of humanitarian support, and it will be continuing. As Lisa mentioned, I'm on the Trade Committee, and I promote gender in trade, and it is becoming a much more mainstreamed issue, particularly after COVID, as women have been very negatively impacted disproportionately, and there's been growing inequality as a result of COVID and the impact globally on women and work and women's rights. So it meets quite a bit of resistance. There is a lot of sort of conservative voices who would say that it's not a real issue for trade. Trade is about exchange of goods and services across international boundaries, but we would go further in my group and say it's also about statement of values and the values that you stand for, and it's a way of leverage of delivering those values globally. So it comes into our work quite regularly. I'm also on the development committee, as I mentioned, albeit a substitute member, and that is something I'm very committed to naturally. One more thing that's going on at the moment that you should be aware is the Conference on the Future of Europe. So there is a web portal for organizing both in-person events and digital events. And there is some great material there to get European citizens to become involved in this conversation about how to renew Europe. Because this is only about the 3rd time that Europe has really looked in on itself, a period of reflection. The most recent one was the Convention on Europe, which was a highly unsuccessful attempt to reform Europe. So hopefully this one will be a bit more interactive, and I think it's, you know, the model from Ireland of a citizens' assembly, of participatory democracy. It's actually inspired some of the work methods of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and we hope to actually have one of the sessions in Dublin. The IAA will be working with the Secretariat of the Conference on the Future of Europe to host what's called a citizens panel in December. That'll be a great opportunity to have that kind of public discussion. Finally, then on the in terms of our voting, so the plenary meets once a month. That's the full meeting of the European Parliament. Today's we're in Brussels, but once a month we go to Strasbourg, and lots of really important reports come before the plenary. And the most recent 2 I'll mention is the Matic report on sexual and reproductive health rights. And we got a huge amount of lobbying from individuals who had concerns about whether the European Union had any competences in the area of abortion. And we kept in touch with people and were able to explain to them what the nature of the report was. But certainly myself and Billy Kelleher on the Fianna Fáil team, we voted in favour of that report. We also voted in favour of a very strong resolution on the rule of law in 1 or 2 European Union member states. And this is part of a wider geopolitical problem of backsliding of democratic values. You know, there's emerging autocracies in areas we never imagined would emerge. And there's a crowd called Freedom House who produced a report earlier this year which showed that less than 20% of the world's population live in free countries, which is a really astonishing fact in 2021. And democracy has slid backwards for 17 consecutive years, according to their report. So that impacts on equality across the globe as well. So there's a lot to fight for. You know, we can't be complacent about democracy itself. It's under threat, and that means the space for civil society shrinking too. So these are really crucial issues, and I think the Conference of the Future of Europe gives us an opportunity to restate some of our values and find ways to strengthen Europe. So my view is what I want to achieve is to represent Dublin and Ireland, North and South, in a stronger Europe. So thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Barry. That's greatly appreciated. And just I should have mentioned at the start, if people would like to kind of see the speaker on full screen, don't forget you can go to the right-hand corner of your own Zoom there and choose speaker view. So Barry, I think you raised some really interesting and important points, especially for the groups represented today, about democracy not being something we can trust. Is always going to be the same and something that we constantly have to work on. And I'm sure we'll hear from all of you in the civil society organisations about how perhaps that's impacted your work and how you'd like to see more perhaps from the European Parliament and the European Union on those areas. So I'll pass over to Francis in just one moment. And just to say ahead of the discussion session, to give you a bit of time, you might wish to just change your name on the Zoom there to perhaps your first name and your organisation, just so while we're having the discussion, we can see who's who. Okay, I'll now pass over to Francis Fitzgerald, please. Thank you. Or sorry, Clare Daly, because I understand Clare has to leave us a bit earlier, and Francis, I'll be with you immediately afterwards. Thanks, Clare.
I hope Francis is okay with that, but yeah, okay. Thanks a million. I have to go to the Security and Defence Committee, which wasn't listed, but I'm actually on that as well, and transport. But as Barry said, it's a bit of a busy week. It's our kind of last full committee week here, and of course, true to form, they've all the same committees going on at the same time. But anyway, look, it's great for me to be here, and thanks very much for having the opportunity to talk about equality and diversity, but specifically in the fields of women's rights and LGBT work also. I mean, I think when I was in the Dáil, the areas of women's rights in particular were of great interest to me. The fight for abortion rights in terms of women's maternal health care, women's pensions and so on. And I think, you know, I suppose I'd be known for being quite critical of the European Parliament in many ways, but I have to say in the fields of women's rights and LGBT rights, that Parliament is strong, it's active, and it's a pretty good place to be actually on these issues. Now, obviously, Francis is on the FEM committee, which I'm not on, but there is the LGBT intergroup, which I'm a member of. There's also a group, MEPs Sexual and Reproductive Rights group, which I'm involved in as well. Obviously, a lot of work has been cut across because of COVID and that we can't get to meet up face to face, but there is an awful lot of stuff going on. And I have to say the Parliament is incredibly active on these issues. It regularly debates them, drafts resolutions on them, produces reports on them. Barry mentioned the Matic report, which was really strong in terms of sexual and reproductive health rights, passed in the recent plenary. Also called on member states to ensure universal access to safe and legal abortion, to guarantee abortion on request in early pregnancy and beyond if the pregnant person's health was in danger, and for member states to set the VAT rate for menstrual products at 0. So all of that was really good and really strong, and the Parliament is usually incredibly vocal on the issue of violence against women and for action to be taken to combat it. I think as well in the area of LGBT rights as well, it has actually been equally strong, passing really uncompromising motions of criticism recently for Hungary, pointing out that its new so-called propaganda law is not an isolated example, but actually constitutes an intentional and premeditated example of the undermining of fundamental rights in Hungary, particularly in the area of LGBTIQ phobia, which has actually become a sort of a tool of political censorship by the Hungarian government. So these issues, actually competition to be a shadow or to follow these files and resolutions is very stiff for these. They're much sought after. In my group in particular, the competition is really fierce, and I haven't been successful in getting too many of them, much as though I would like. But we do get to deal with these issues a lot because I'm a member of the Civil Liberties Committee, or the LIBE Committee as they call it. And because there's a kind of, I suppose we'll call it a soft liberal majority on that committee, we actually do put forward very strong positions on it. So my first point really is, if you're coming from this field of CSOs in this area and you're lobbying the European Parliament, you really are very much pushing an open door. And I think that is an important point to make. I mean, I was the rapporteur of the Parliament's Fundamental Rights Report last year, and there was murder on some of the issues, really passionate and sometimes very bitter arguments over certain aspects of the file that we wanted to include, issues around, like, say, police violence or media freedom or that kind of thing. But actually on the equality section, it was far easier. And we ended up getting a report that was really very strong on women's rights, on compromising statements that women and girls must have control over their own bodies, calling for member states to guarantee comprehensive sexuality education, access to family planning, full reproductive rights, including modern contraception, and also which I thought was important, an affirmation that the denial of sexual and reproductive health rights constitutes a form of violence against women and girls. And there was also very good work done on condemning in that report the treatment of women and girls from a Roma background in terms of their position in reproductive health care settings. I mean, we go on about European values and all that, but the idea that in parts of the European Union today, Roma women are segregated in maternity hospitals, not to mind the forced sterilisation and so on that went on in the not too recent past, is an absolute disgrace and so on. I think the report also highlighted very well state and non-state sponsored campaigns across Europe to discredit civil society organisations who defend LGBTQI rights, and condemned governments and politicians who use hate speech and anti-LGBTQI rhetoric. So I think important work was done on those reports. I'm not going to go into a huge amount about Hungary and Poland, which are to the forefront of the backtracking in terms of women's rights and LGBTI rights. And the Parliament has been really vocal on this, much better than the Council, much better than the Commission, in pushing for action to be taken against these two countries. The outrageous LGBT free zones, Hungary's terrible propaganda laws, and obviously the restriction of abortion in Poland and so on. So I think that's really important. And for us in Ireland, I suppose, when we were struggling in these areas for reform, and it's probably a talking point that actually Ireland is one of the few European examples now where progress has been made in actually advancing fundamental rights in these areas. The bigger story in Europe is a backtracking on this, but when we benefited so much from solidarity from Europe and from outside Europe, when we were struggling on these issues, it is important that we stand in solidarity with citizens in these countries who are trying to halt the retreat and who are trying to defend rights there. But in focusing on Hungary and Poland, I think we need to be very careful that they're not the only ones. And I do have a bit of a problem with this sometimes. And sometimes the governments of Hungary and Poland, and they have a certain argument in this, say, well, why are you picking on us? There's loads of other things as well. Now, obviously, we're picking on them because they're in flagrant violation of fundamental rights, but we park that. The point is there are other EU countries who are similarly engaged who don't get the same attention, and that's a problem. And I think it's something we need to focus on. And I've been to Bulgaria a number of times over the past year, and similar attacks are happening here, and they are condoned at the highest levels of Bulgarian society. I mean, surveys have been done there saying that young LGBT students in Bulgarian schools feel very vulnerable. 70% of them have been verbally abused, nearly 40% physically abused. Homophobia is across the board. Homophobic comment by senior politicians would not be unusual. Violent crimes would not be unusual. I met LGBTIQ activists in Plovdiv, a city in Bulgaria, who had tried to organize an ordinary, I think they put on a film show of gay culture and so on. They were targeted, beaten up, painted on their buildings and their workplaces, basically with threats to kill them. And that is often condoned by the police and so on. So the only point I'm making is on that, but we do have to, for me, and it's a point we've done in our work on the Libe Committee, we have to call this out wherever it occurs. It's not just about Poland and Hungary, it goes beyond that. And the Parliament has been pretty quiet in, I suppose, criticising other member states who would be maybe not as unpopular as Hungary and Poland. So countries that might be a little bit more in with the ruling parties in Europe don't get condemned as much. And that's something that I think deserves more explanation. The last point I'll make is in terms of rule of law. There has been some good progress made, and the Parliament has pushed this, and we've been involved in that, in insisting that countries get funding from Europe should be compliant with the rule of law and respect for fundamental rights. I mean, it should be an ABC in that regard. The rule of law mechanism, there was a rule of law report on all of the countries last year. I'd have some criticisms of it, to be honest. There's another one coming out. It's great that they did it, but it was weak enough. And I've commissioned a study on this rule of law mechanism and how it could be improved, and I'll make that available to all of the groups. We've done it with some academics in Kent University as to how this could be a better tool for improving fundamental rights. It's in the process of it's just been completed. It's in the process of being published, and I'll make that available to people when it comes out over the next period. But I mean, all in all, being on the Libe Committee, which is one of the four committees I'm on, these issues get aired all the time. And as I said, you're pushing an open door. So if there are particular things that you think we should be raising from an Irish example, or particular examples that we can use to benefit our European counterparts, well, then I'd be very happy to hear it in the time that I've left in attendance. And thanks very much for being here and for your good work on these issues at home.
Thanks so much, Claire. That's greatly appreciated. And again, really important points, and great to hear that it's an open door and that's been your experience. I'm sure that'll be music to some people's ears here. I'll pass over now to Frances, who, as many people mentioned, very importantly, is on the FEM committee, which does excellent work in these areas. So Frances, delighted to hear from yourself.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to join with you all and to hear your concerns. You've heard quite a lot already from Barry and from Claire on the work that's being done in the European Parliament, and I didn't know Barry had taken up that role on the SDGs. I think that's really important, and quite a bit of the work is seeing how the SDGs kind of marry into the sort of decisions that are taken in the European Parliament, but it's often an afterthought, and so there's a lot of work to do in that area, and particularly if we can get the work done on the SDG and equality. I think everybody, and I've been at so many meetings and seminars and discussions in the last year where everybody says, if we can really continue to do the work on equality in the broadest sense, it impacts on so many of the other SDGs. So that's kind of an important point. And what Claire says about it being an open door in relation to equality and LGBTQI rights as well, I think that's absolutely true. But there's kind of interesting points to be made about where the European Parliament is at present. And, I would say that right now, everything is seen through a COVID lens. Obviously, that's been the absolute preoccupation for the last year. It's also seen through a green lens and a digital, because the future is digital. I would also add through the care issues that have emerged in the last year are incredibly important. And I would also say equality. And if you're to summarize the kind of, the broad thrust of the work in the Parliament, I think all of those kind of areas, you know, there's various points that come under those particular kind of categories, and we're all involved to various or lesser degrees. I mean, I've always been a big fan of the EU, dating back to when I was in the Women's Council, and I always felt sort of encouraged and supported by the leadership at EU level. And I have to say, you know, all these years later, I won't count how many there are, but there are many, over 30 years later, to see what the European Parliament is still doing, I'm still hugely encouraged by it. And the research that's done is of a really high quality. The model of working, I so much, you know, I just think it's wonderful compared to some of the experiences that I've had personally in the Dáil, the kind of consensus model and coming to compromises. And of course, there were left to right differences, but there's a huge amount of, you know, a progressive, constructive exchange of views with people from all of the different parties, and very often really good resolutions, compromises, action, legislation, and so on happens in the European Parliament. So I continue to be a fan of it and greatly encouraged, you know, by the work that's done. And it's always worth looking up the research papers that come out that are widely available. It's always worth seeing, you know, the latest report on different topics, whether it's, you know, could be HIV and AIDS, it could be, you know, particular issues of custody, all of them, the quality of and the content, it's really at cutting edge. And I think it's good to remind ourselves of how progressive Europe is compared to many other parts of the world, and that we are leading on climate change, we are leading on equality, we are leading on many of the rights issues. But of course, what I would immediately say, you know, and Ireland, you know, fares reasonably well by comparison, despite all the work we have to do. But I would absolutely say, and it's a phrase I've always used, you know, we do live in unfinished democracies. And I have been actually shocked by what I have seen in the European Parliament in terms of backlash from quite a number of member states. It's actually, you know, it's almost caught me by surprise that, because it seems to be very much an era of authoritarian men in particular, of very hierarchical leadership, certainly in quite a number of Eastern European countries, where gender is seen as a threat, gender equality, where LGBTQI rights are seen as a threat to the established order. Where, for example, in the Matic report, which I personally supported, but many in my group had difficulties on it because they see abortion as a national issue, but there was an incredible amount of lobbying from the Catholic Church. I was amazed by it. I mean, it kind of goes on there, and I was surprised to see the depth. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, if you know what I mean. It was kind of all out there, and huge pressure on individual members of the Parliament from the church. And we're so used to separation of church and state in Ireland now. It was late coming, granted, but we're certainly, it's how we operate now, the vast majority of the time, and I would say the vast majority of politicians. So that's been interesting to see. And, you know, you've heard a lot from both Clare and Barry about that backlash, so I won't go into any more detail on it, just to say that, you know, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom, and that I do think, given the experiences we've had in Ireland in terms of equality, we can have and should play that international role in terms of influencing, moving forward. But you take the Istanbul Convention on violence against women. You know, the reason quite a number of countries will not, you know, sign off finally on that is they see it as a Trojan horse for LGBTQ rights, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it. It's, you know, it isn't, as it happens, but that is the excuse. And now we're trying to get legislation making violence against women, gender-based violence, making it a European crime, adding it to the list of Euro crimes. So I'm on a couple of committees. I mean, the intensity of the work is enormous. I mean, it is, I think all your MEPs are incredibly hardworking and involved in a whole range of issues. In fact, in any one day, it's hard to really grasp everything that's going on. You know, you've hundreds of votes, like even this morning, I think 300 or 400 votes first thing this morning on a report that we're working on gender violence as it happened in the FAM committee. The FAM committee is very active, and I'm going to run through a number of the areas that we're involved in, just to give you a kind of a flavor of the work that we're doing. I'm also on the Development Committee. I'm a substitute member of that, and on the Committee on Disinformation, which is a new committee. And I have to say, Clare and I probably disagree on some of the presentations we've seen on it, but it really is something that I think we have to be very alert to, and that's fake news and the impact it's having, and the propaganda that's been spread by various countries, the underlying influences going on in our social media, the role of Russia and China, which I think we really, have to be alert to. Now, as I say, there'll be different political views on that. But, many of the presentations of that have really been quite shocking and disturbing. And I think it's an issue that we need to get on top of. And again, fake news is something I feel very concerned about myself. I mean, you've just seen the report that came out from the Disclosures Tribunal, and to see the kind of data that's emerged there about something I actually was dealing with as Minister for Justice, and you see the reality of what actually the facts were. So I think fake news is really something that we have to be very alert to, all of us who work in politics or NGOs. It's something to inform ourselves about and really understand and take note of. So I did say that everything in the European Parliament now is, really has been seen through the eyes of COVID. And I would say that the financial response, just to look at the macro situation for a moment, the financial response from the European Parliament to support countries is bigger and better than ever before, and quite speedy. And that's really important. Over $1 trillion made available, and very good programs. And we see it here in Ireland in PUP, and we see it in support to businesses and so on. So much better than, the previous financial crisis, the actual financial response. Interesting again to see health becoming more and more an area where the European Parliament and the European institutions are interested in. This thing about what's a European competence, what's a national competence. Well, health was always seen as a national competence, but I work on lung cancer groups, and I do a lot of work on breast cancer. I head up a group that's an initiative, Transforming Breast Cancer Initiative. And it's really interesting more and more to see that if we want to tackle the big issues, the big health issues of our time, we absolutely need to work at a European level. If you want to get drugs to Irish people, the new innovative drugs that are coming out at an extraordinary rate, we absolutely need to be working at European level to look at the cost of drugs and the access and so on. So this is very interesting for me to see the increased, the increased communication and health, and the seeing it as more and more a European competence, which I think it needs to be. So that'll be an interesting one for the conference on the future of Europe to discuss. So going quickly over then what the FAM committee is doing at the moment. I did a report on COVID, the differential impact of COVID on women and men, because there is a differential impact. As you know, far more men and older men are dying. The socio-economic impacts are very high on women. Some disagreement on the employment impacts, but it's, sorry, is that reverberating there? But so I think we need to be very, why is that repeating? I wonder, it's gone now, is it?
Somebody was off mute, but they're muted now,
right,
Francis.
Right. But to make the point about the recovery, one of the interesting things that's happened is that we now have an obligation on member states to look at the gender impact of their budgeting and their recovery plans. And I think this is something for all NGO organizations and all politicians to be very aware of, because I don't think there's been enough of gender impact assessment on the spending of funds, and they now have to do it, each member state, and the Commission is going to monitor it. And that's really important. So you can spend those funds on retraining, upskilling, and it's huge money we're talking about, some countries more than other. I mean, Hungary is going to get 7 billion. And, what we have now is this mechanism that, again, Claire mentioned, that, you could sanction from a budgetary point of view. And I think we're going to have to move towards that. Now, it'll be slow, but it'll be very interesting to watch whether that new law that allows conditionality on the budget will be used on these human rights issues. But it's a direction of travel, I think, that's likely, to accelerate in the time ahead. So I've mentioned violence against women and gender-based violence generally. Then if you look at the economic side, the recovery is obviously from a gender point of view hugely important. It's important for all of us. So the gender pay gap bill, that's going through at present. And a bit like the Irish legislation, that's looking for more pay transparency. And if you get to that point where companies and everybody has to publish details of their pay, then I think you'll probably deal with that dreadful pension gap we have across Europe, which is at 39%. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And of course, makes for huge vulnerability for women and for older women in terms of, you know, the supports available. So it's an extraordinary, serious problem that we haven't made much inroads on. Women on boards, that's trying to get women into decision making more. That's an area we're looking at. Countries have been very slow to support that at council level, the prime ministers and so on. Trying to develop a European care strategy as well. Yesterday, I published a new care strategy, a European care strategy for my own party, and I want to see Europe dealing with the European care strategy. Like Claire, I'm a member of the LGBTI intergroup, the Children's Rights intergroup, and the MEPs Against Cancer. So we take various initiatives around all of these areas. Look, I think any one of us could go on a lot about different aspects of the work, but I hope that gives you a flavour of the work that we're doing. There's many individual reports we all work on, and the FAM committee has a whole number of reports coming through in the next few months on different topics, and they include women's poverty in Europe, reaching women's economic independence through entrepreneurship and self-employment, looking at that area, and looking at the socio-economic background of women of African, Middle Eastern, Latin America, and Asian descent in the European Union, and examining what is the experience of these women across Europe. So I think, you know, a lot of work going on, but I'll conclude by saying that I think we all operate an open door. I have an office here in Dublin. Delighted to hear from people, whether it's requesting information or wanting to tell us what you're doing and how we might be able to support you. So look forward to hearing what everyone has to say on these very important topics. Thanks very much, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Frances, and many thanks to Clare Daly and Barry Andrews as well for their inputs. And we're